I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Donald Trump vows to harness the momentum of the Gaza ceasefire to bring peace to Ukraine, we examine global reaction, or the striking silence, after a UN convoy was attacked by Russian forces. Then we assess reports of a possible chemical weapons attack in Donetsk, and hear a deep dive into stories emerging from inside Russia, revealing the cracks in its economy and the growing strains within its society.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody is going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 14th of October, 3 years and 234 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, former tank commander and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, and the Telegraph's former Russia correspondent, James Kilner. But first, over to Dom for the latest on the military situation.
Thanks, Francis. Hello, everybody. So, Ukraine's back in focus today after the first phase of the Gaza peace plan was enacted yesterday with events in Israel. In a speech to Israel's parliament, you may have caught it, Donald Trump said it would be great if we could make a peace deal with Iran, but first we have to get Russia done. Let's focus on Russia. He was speaking to the Knesset. So that's where the focus seems to be. He's going to be meeting President Zelensky on Friday, we hear, with the possible provision of Tomahawk cruise missiles setting the agenda. Notably yesterday, US defence company Oshkosh revealed a new mobile ground-based missile launcher capable of firing Tomahawks. It was presented at an arms fair in Washington, D.C., the XMAV, Extreme Multi-Mission Autonomous Vehicles, shown in a configuration with 4 Tomahawk cruise missiles on board. So just lucky timing for the company, or managed to rush it out the gates quickly. But more on Friday's meeting from Francis shortly. Let's go into Ukraine. On the ground, I'll point you to an article in Euromaidan Press, the online Ukrainian news site, that says Ukrainian forces are encircling Unikivka. That's a Russian-held town about 30 kilometres northeast of Sumy city in the northeast of Ukraine, still inside Ukraine. They're saying they are encircling it and aiming to take the town back, not by attacking it, but by choking the supply lines and clearing the forests on the southern side of the town with quad bike raids. Now, Russian troops are said to be stuck inside this pocket, facing drones, hunger, and even death while trying to surrender. The article says Russian commanders, bound by the obsession with holding territory at all costs, refuse to withdraw, even from doomed positions, which the Ukrainians are counting on and more than ready to exploit. Unikivka's open layout with scattered and burned out buildings offers no cover and no reason for the Ukrainians to engage in a storming operation, which would only cost losses in an attritional battle that can hardly be won against an opponent with more troops on the ground. They say Russians switched to the defensive operations there after their attempt to push south towards Sumy city was stopped by drones and artillery. Since then, the tempo of the battle has slowed down significantly. Now, we can't verify this. We'll include the link, as I said. We can't verify it, and I have to say there's not been a lot of ground changed hands in that area recently, but I think it is an interesting article on the tactics being employed. But do have a look at the link in the episode notes. Similar picture across the rest of the country elsewhere. Yesterday, next to no move on the ground. Doesn't mean it was not still very busy, very violent. Kharkiv was hit with glide bombs yesterday. 57 people injured across the city, Ukraine's foreign ministry said, including 6 in a hospital that was damaged. The Kharkiv Regional Prosecutor's Office said Russia launched an airstrike on the Saltivsky district, that's in the east of Kharkiv, around 10 p.m. local time last night. More than 100 patients were in the hospital at the time, with one, Svetlana Vodolazhka, telling Suspilna Kharkiv, Russia boasts that it does not harm civilians, but look, are we not civilians? President Zelensky called it an utterly terrorist, cynical attack on a place where lives are being saved. And then Estonia's Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna said, by bombing a city hospital in Kharkiv with a guided missile, Russia sinks to a new level of barbarism. It shows absolute disregard for human life by targeting people receiving life-saving care. This is yet another stark reminder of the urgent need to provide Ukraine with more air defences and military aid to protect its people and push back the aggression. Okay, further south, the head of the Kherson Regional Military Administration, Alexander Prokudin, he said this morning that Russia had hit a United Nations humanitarian mission in the Kherson region. It took place about 5 kilometres west of Kherson city, just across the Dnieper River from Russian forces. Mr. Prokudin said in the morning, in the Belozerka community, Russian troops fired targeted shots from drones and artillery at United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs trucks, so the OCHA trucks. He said 4 UN vehicles with appropriate markings were attacked. There was no military equipment there, he said. The vehicles were carrying aid to people. And in a statement, OCHA Ukraine said today humanitarian workers, including from OCHA Ukraine and the World Food Programme, came under attack in Belozerka in Kherson region while delivering aid to civilians. They then pointed to a statement that's gone up in the last half an hour on the UN's website by the humanitarian coordinator for Ukraine, Matthias Shimale, who strongly condemned the attack. He said, clearly marked as belonging to the UN, these were the vehicles, came under attack by the armed forces of the Russian Federation when delivering aid. Humanitarian workers, including from OCHA Ukraine and the World Health Organization, were on a mission to provide humanitarian aid to a heavily war-impacted community that had not received assistance for months. When the aid workers were on site, intensive artillery fire started, and later, during offloading, 2 clearly marked trucks of the World Food Programme were targeted by first-person view drones. That bit's important because obviously artillery might land somewhere it's not intended. There's no excuse for first-person view drones. The statement carried on. Fortunately, the humanitarian workers were not injured, but 2 trucks were damaged and set on fire. They say such attacks are unacceptable. Aid workers are protected by international humanitarian law and should never be attacked. Civilians remaining in frontline areas are heavily reliant on humanitarian assistance, and aid workers should be able to deliver life-saving assistance safely. Deliberately targeting humanitarians and humanitarian assets is a gross violation of international humanitarian law and might amount to a war crime. The Kherson region has also seen an increase in drone attacks harming civilians. These attacks must stop. All measures should be taken to protect civilians and humanitarian workers. International humanitarian law must be respected. So well done. I say well done, United Nations Ukraine, for naming Russia, for calling out Russia. I look forward to seeing this news on the main UN website. It's not there yet. The lead story on the main UN website is a story titled Ushering in a New Era of Fusion Energy. That important story pushed even news about Gaza and the dire situation in South Sudan off the top slot. We'll put a link in the episode notes to the UN statement, or UN Ukraine's statement. And I've just seen that Andrea de Dominico, who's the head of OCHA Ukraine, who was in the convoy at the time of the attack, he's posted something on Twitter. I've just retweeted it. He's speaking from the site. Now, yesterday, there were 96 drones fired by Russia across Ukraine. Most were shot down, but 4 got through and hit an oil depot in the Nizhyn area of Chernihiv Oblast. There were injuries in the city also. I don't know if that's part of the same attack. There were strikes elsewhere across the country, including in Sumy Oblast in the north and Kirovrad Oblast in the centre of the country. Now let's go into Russia and look again at TASS, the state-owned media, Kremlin media, their daily section titled In Brief, What We Know About Overnight Ukrainian Drone Attacks on Russian Regions. So today they report how Russian Ministry of Defense said 40 Ukrainian drones were shot down over numerous Russian regions and the Black Sea. They say temporary restrictions were imposed at the Nizhny Novgorod airport, that's 300 kilometres east of Moscow. And the local governor there said an energy facility had been hit. I said it before, nothing says your 3-week lightning advance is going brilliantly like having your own state-owned media giving daily updates on strikes in your country 3 years later. Although, while Moscow said 40 drones were shot down, the military headquarters in Russia's Belgorod Oblast obviously didn't get the memo about keeping shtum about any that did get through, because they said, this is the Russian operational headquarters in Belgorod this morning, reporting on its own Telegram channel, that they'd been hit by 120 Ukrainian drones and had only managed to shoot down 7. Now, outside Russia and Ukraine, the first F-35 fighter jets from the US arrived in Belgium yesterday, paving the way for the transfer of Belgian F-16s to Ukraine. Fire trucks at the Florence Air Base welcome the jets in traditional style by soaking them with water. Never quite sure where that comes from. But the Belgian Air Force has ordered 45 F-35s to replace its entire fleet of F-16s. And then just finally, you may remember I reported yesterday on that Russian submarine that was spotted on the surface in the English Channel. Well, later on yesterday, Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, mocked Russia over the condition of the submarine after it was spotted on the surface, apparently having suffered technical issues. This is the Russian diesel-powered submarine Novorossiysk, surfaced off France, Russians say, to comply with navigation rules in the English Channel. Moscow rejected reports it had suffered a serious malfunction. They said it was instead conducting a scheduled inter-fleet transit after completing tasks in the Mediterranean. However, Dutch authorities said that the submarine was under tow. Mr. Rutte, during a speech in Slovenia, he said the vessel was broken, and he said, now, in effect, there is hardly any Russian naval presence in the Mediterranean left. There's a lone and broken Russian submarine limping home from patrol. What a change from the 1984 Tom Clancy novel, The Hunt for Red October. Today, it seems more like the hunt for the nearest mechanic. Anyway, I mean, I'm sure he's a lovely guy. I don't know if I'd want to sit next to him at a dinner party. But actually, I would, Mr. Rutte, if the offer's there. It comes after the Telegram channel that publishes purported Russian security leaks did say, I'd missed it, but I saw it today. Apologies, I can't see who pointed me to it. But on September the 27th, they said that fuel was leaking into the hold of the Novorossiysk, raising the risk of an explosion. So maybe that's why it was on the surface. Now it's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. One of the open questions following the ceasefire in Gaza has been whether it would bring an end to Trump's peace efforts or whether he would seek to use that as momentum to go further and to try and settle the Ukraine war. And as you say, it seems we have an answer. Further to what you've just quoted, in that speech to the Israeli parliament yesterday, Trump extolled the White House policy of peace through strength in the Middle East, leading to a renewed hope that philosophy might be taken in relation to Russia as well. Hence the remarks of President Zelensky after the fact. We are working so that the day of peace comes for Ukraine as well. Russian aggression remains the last global source of destabilization. And if a ceasefire and peace has been achieved for the Middle East, the leadership and determination of global actors can certainly work for us too. No doubt the Ukrainians will be urging Trump to give them tomahawks in that meeting at the White House on Friday. Certainly the US president seems to be enjoying dangling them as a threat. I might say, look, if this war's not going to get settled, I'm going to send them tomahawks, Trump said on Sunday. I might have to speak to Russia, to be honest with you, about tomahawks. Do you want to have tomahawks going in their direction? I don't think so. Yet again, we have to return, though, to the perennial question of just how likely it is that Trump will be that assertive against Putin. The news that he's granted key intelligence to the Ukrainians to strike at Russian energy infrastructure will spark some optimism, but others will point to the gulf between sharing intelligence and actually giving such long-range weapons. However, Kyiv, both publicly and privately, seems to be emphasising they would only use them on energy infrastructure. And given the ramifications that has on global energy markets, offering opportunities for the United States, it just might shift the dial in their favour. Regardless of the healthy scepticism, though, perhaps the biggest evidence tomahawks are actively being considered comes from the fact the Kremlin is constantly talking about it. So the Russian Foreign Ministry ambassador today said that the possibility of those weapons raises questions about just how genuine US President Donald Trump's approach truly is. He said if Trump is now trying to assert pressure, provide military assistance to the gangsters, that old chestnut again, and supply them with long-range weapons such as tomahawks, then this raises the question of how authentic his peacemaking efforts truly are, or whether he is starting to follow the same path as Biden, trying to support the Ukrainian side and escalate the conflict further. This is the political dispute currently unfolding. Now, that reference to Biden is very clever. Since taking office, Trump has consistently, as you know, blamed Biden for the war. So any association with Trump's efforts and his predecessors is likely to sting. Though it does seem that there are more and more voices around the president saying that he's being manipulated by the Kremlin, encouraging him to go further. But the question remains, just what are Trump's limits? And is Europe still too dependent on Washington to be the determinant factor in trying to bring this war to an end? Now, staying with America, there's been some welcome news from the US Senate in the last 48 hours, which has now passed the Abducted Ukrainian Children Recovery and Accountability Act. That bipartisan legislation aimed at helping Ukraine locate, return and rehabilitate children abducted by Russia during the invasion. As Dom mentioned yesterday, it was adopted as part of the National Defense Authorization Act for 2026. It will now move to the House of Representatives for a vote. Once signed by the president, it will become federal law, requiring American institutions to provide practical support to Ukraine in tracking, returning and restoring the rights of abducted children. That is a hugely positive step from where we were a few months ago, when the government was actively shutting down programs and reducing funding for bodies assisting with this issue. Could Melania Trump's public interest in the stolen children have had an impact on this? We don't know, but if you do, let us know. But let's bring things back to Europe now. There's yet another intelligence chief, this time a sitting one, urging European leaders to act given the severity of the situation. Martin Jaeger, president of the Federal Intelligence Service in Germany, told lawmakers that Russia is ready to test European borders and escalate the current tensions into an open confrontation at any moment. We can't simply wait and assume that a potential Russian attack won't come before 2029, he said. We're already under fire today. Russia is concealing its true intentions, but in fact it's probing our borders, he told the Bundestag. At best, Europe is in a state of cold peace, one that could flare into a hot confrontation at any point. Now, Jaeger's an interesting man. He previously served as an ambassador to Kyiv, so he understands Russia and what it's capable of very well. Indeed, he said in the proceedings that Moscow will interpret restraint as weakness, adding, "We must confront our adversaries wherever necessary." But despite this apparent danger, the EU is still struggling to make a breakthrough on the comparatively modest proposals in the latest sanctions package. Speaking yesterday, the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, stated that discussions regarding the 19th package are still ongoing. Each time we face difficulties, she said, because we are 27 member states and 27 different democracies. So the debates continue. We are trying to achieve a result before the European summit, which will take place next week. One thing she was able to announce was the first 10 million euros for the special tribunal to ensure those responsible for the crimes of aggression don't escape justice. We hope to dedicate a segment to that new tribunal in a future episode. For now, I'll just leave you with retired General Ben Hodges, who I interviewed in Germany and who you have heard in Friday's episode. He didn't mince his words when it came to giving advice to those assembling that body. He said, "The name and face of every Russian officer in the chain of command responsible for any war crimes should be published, so that they must look over their shoulder and under their car for the rest of their lives." He posted that yesterday. And while we're on the subject of war crimes, I'm going to bring in Hamish briefly, as we have seen a story circulating on social media this week alleging Ukrainians blew up a pipeline in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic to, according to the Russians, slow the advance of Russian troops. Now, Hamish is going to come on properly next week to do a deep dive into various subjects, but we thought we'd bring him in here because the footage shows plumes of ammonia covering a field. And I wondered what Hamish made of it and how accurate he thinks those reports are. Welcome back, Hamish. What did you make of it?
Yeah, thanks. Good to be back, Francis, Dom and James. We've talked a lot about chemical weapon use further to the east in the Donbass. That has seemed to have regressed a bit, not least because there are a load of British respirators, gas masks out there. But this particular incident is really, really interesting and something I've sort of come across before, actually, in Iraq, and Syria. So ammonia, many, many uses. It's toxic industrial chemical, but it is favoured by various despots and terrorists that I've seen before. The Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians have blown up a pipeline full of ammonia. Ammonia is bleach, although it is a very, very low percentage. We're talking here about really high concentrations. Ammonia is a chemical weapon, and it is a chemical weapon. It is what we call a choking agent. When you breathe it in, a bit like chlorine, basically chokes you and is fatal. Now, when I was working with the Peshmerga in northern Iraq in the fight against ISIS, 2016, the ISIS blew up a massive chemical facility called Al-Mashrak, which put about 400,000 tons of sulfur dioxide into the air in a very deliberate military act at the time. So Al-Mashrak is about 40 k's south of Mosul, if people know that sort of area of Iraq. And at the time, the Iraqi army were coming up from the south, the Peshmerga we were on, over to the east of Mosul. But by blowing up Al-Mashrak, this cloud of toxic gas stopped the Iraqi advance dead. So there is precedence in using toxic chemicals as a sort of barrier because, you know, unless you are fully prepared in all your, as the Americans say, mop kit, suits and gloves and all the rest of it, you can't really go through it. So when we look at this particular incident, is this really Ukraine trying to do something to prevent Russians moving forward? Or was it Russia trying to do the opposite? Tactically, it is viable because it will stop people. Actually, when you see the footage, the downwind hazard that we call it, in other words, where is this toxic stuff going, is sort of going south to north. In other words, you know, why would the Ukrainians blow it up and then it comes back over their own positions? Who would gain most from this? It's the sort of Russians. And the fact that they're making such a big thing of it, as we've seen with other false flag type issues, people who would gain most from this, especially if they can convince the world it's not them and it's the Ukrainians, would certainly be the Russians. So I think there is precedent here. We've seen in Ukraine actually back to sort of 2014, 2015 times where Russia or Russia separatists have targeted chemical facilities in Ukraine. And at the very start of the war, back in, I think it was April 2022, there was a chemical facility to the northeast of Kyiv that was hit and produced sort of toxic clouds. So looking at the evidence, this is the sort of thing despots and dictators use as a sort of improvised chemical weapon. It's highly effective, and Russia have done it before.
Thank you very much, Hamish, for that overview. And just before you go, I know that you've also been quite focused recently on Pokrovsk and have been talking to various soldiers who've discussed their experiences of chemical weapons there. Just before you go, perhaps you could fill us in on that.
Yeah, certainly. And in fact, I'm running a sort of think piece study day in a few weeks' time. And we've got people coming back from Pokrovsk who've been at the real heart of protecting the Ukrainian troops who've been directly attacked by the Russians with chloropicrin, as we've discussed before. They've developed ESO standard operating procedures so they can get round this, and they've now got lots of British gas masks. But having said that, even last weekend, the Russians were still using chloropicrin on the trenches, but not having the same impact. They haven't managed to generate the tempo the Russians this is with a massive use of chloropicrin. But hopefully I'll interview these guys when they're in London and maybe do a separate bit for the pod then. And as I said, France will be back next week. That'll be a great opportunity to discuss where we are in the tank world.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish. We very much look forward to that next week. Let's bring in then our former Russia correspondent here at the Telegraph and regular on the podcast, James Kilner. James, welcome back. You're here to talk us through the latest round of updates, really, from the domestic situation in Russia. And it's been an interesting one. So many things we could cover. But I know the first story that's caught your eye is perhaps somewhat niche on the surface, but is revealing about tensions between Russia and former Soviet states. Welcome back, James.
Hi, Francis. Pleasure to be back as usual. The CIS summit in Dushanbe at the end of last week was actually very important. Not so much the summit itself, but what happens around the fringes. And what I'm particularly focusing on here is a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Ilham Aliyev, the Azerbaijani president, last Thursday. So the day before the CIS summit, Putin and Aliyev shaking hands and sitting down for a chat. This was the first time these two guys have met for 12 months. As I've been talking about quite a lot on your podcast, as we know, there was a total collapse in bilateral relations between Azerbaijan and Russia after Russian air defense systems accidentally shot down an Azerbaijani airliner above Grozny on Christmas Day last year. Putin, a couple of days after that incident, issued a really measly statement, basically blaming the pilots, shifting responsibility. This completely irritated Aliyev. Relations subsequently collapsed. Both sides arrested various businessmen, journalists, tech workers, etc. We had the incredible side of Russian tech workers being roughed up by Azerbaijani security services and then paraded in Azerbaijani courts. Just incredible for anyone from the Central Asia, South Caucasus region who's used to seeing that sort of thing happen to their own people, not to Russians. Relations got so bad between Azerbaijan and Russia that I would say the peace deal signed in Washington between Azerbaijan and Armenia was a complete result of that. Basically, Azerbaijan started shifting from being buddy-buddy with Russia over to the West, to the point where Aliyev is traveling to Washington to sign a peace deal with Armenia. This would have been absolutely inconceivable a year earlier. And I think the Kremlin basically woke up to the fact that they were going to lose a key ally. Not only was Azerbaijan important for numbers, but Azerbaijan also sits on this very important trade route that the Kremlin has been developing. It's called the North-South trade route, imaginatively, basically between Russia and India, through the Russian Caucasus, down through Dagestan, Azerbaijan, Iran, and then over the sea to India. The Kremlin has poured in billions in this. And then suddenly they had this diplomatic fallout. And so all intents and purposes, the trade route could have become unusable if they'd impact our relations. So here we have Putin literally apologizing in public in front of the cameras to Aliyev. This is a huge climb down from the Russian president. You just don't see this sort of thing at all. He was talking about a tragic circumstance. He was talking about compensation payments. He admitted live on TV Russian air defense system had exploded near this passenger jet and had hit the passenger jet. The passenger jet then limped over the Caspian Sea and crashed into Kazakhstan. Actually, 38 people were killed. In amongst this apology, he also made the point that not only did he want to reset relations with Azerbaijan, he wanted to boost them. This is a very important moment. Aliyev, who has, played his hand relatively well on this, seemed to accept the apology. Relations seem to have been reset. The day after this incredible apology from Putin, Azerbaijan actually released a journalist that they'd arrested in June, a Russian journalist they'd arrested in June in Baku. So he was released the next day as a sort of I don't know, what you call a peace offering or a thank you, whatever, part of this sort of rebuilding of relationships. And then this week, really importantly, Francis, we've seen a previously postponed conference between Russia, Azerbaijan and Iran in Baku over this north-south trade route actually take place. It's happening currently, had been postponed. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Overchuk is representing the Kremlin there, so quite a high level. So really important piece of diplomacy there by the Kremlin, almost admitting that it messed up. It screwed up over the handling of this tragedy, the shooting down of this airliner on Christmas Day, and it's finally sort of 10 months later shown some flexibility. So Kremlin working hard there to repair relations. One final point in this one, we hadn't actually seen Aliyev picking up the phone to Zelensky and talking to him while the relations were bad, agreeing to gas deals. There was even some unconfirmed reports that Azerbaijani hardware had found their way into the Ukrainian military machine. I have to say it's unconfirmed. But clearly the Kremlin had become very worried about this. And it got to the point where Putin actually had to make his public apology.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much, James. It's not the only sort of embarrassment, really, around a summit and meetings with world leaders. What's the next story that you want to cover relating to events of this week?
Slightly shorter story, this one, Francis. The Kremlin trailed since April a major summit for Middle Eastern leaders in the Kremlin in Moscow happening this week, but they cancelled it at the end of last week. There's conflicting reports about why. Putin and the Kremlin said themselves that they cancelled this summit because they didn't want to overshadow the peace deal in Gaza, etc., which is obviously taking all the attention in the Middle East. But other sort of sources, insiders, have been telling Russian Telegram channels and news outlets, slightly oppositional news outlets, that actually the Kremlin had just failed to get the numbers. It didn't get the senior Middle Eastern leaders that it needed. They invited 22 heads of states. They'd expected the leaders from Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, etc., to all turn up. and they just weren't getting those names. Now, the really interesting thing here is that analysts have started to talk about the Trump factor. So the Trump factor is looming so large that apparently the Middle Eastern leaders weren't going to turn up in Moscow because Trump has called on relations with Russia recently. As we know, he's frustrated that the peace process around Ukraine has floundered and he's blamed Putin. And the line is from these analysts that the Middle Eastern leaders stayed away from this Kremlin summit because they didn't want to upset Trump. Now, that's not the Kremlin's line. The Kremlin's line is we're just doing the right thing. We've got every intention of restaging this, rearranging this. We just didn't want to upset the peace process. What is really important, the context here for your listeners around Ukraine, is that in many ways, the Kremlin has outplayed the West on the diplomatic front throughout the war in Ukraine. It has managed to tie in decent relations with the Middle East, African states, Asian states, etc., through its nuclear diplomacy, through its oil and gas diplomacy, through generally being clever. To the point, if you remember, Francis, last year's so-called peace summit in Switzerland, lots of the Middle Eastern leaders either declined to come or they turned up and didn't show the communique, which was going to blame Russia for the war. So what we're potentially seeing around the cancellation of the summit is a shift in certainly Middle Eastern sentiment towards Moscow. I don't want to overstate it, but there may be something in this linked to the Trump factor, which shows that sentiment is shifting away from the Kremlin.
It's a really interesting story, James. And I remember when I was reading about it at the time, it sort of felt like, it does signal a shift of power in that region from where we were only really a handful of years ago, when it feels like Russia would have been far, far more prominent in these discussions relating to Gaza and to the Middle Eastern region more broadly. Just worth signalling that, and perhaps, who knows, the impact of the loss of influence over Syria has played a role in that. But James, we've got to cover it, haven't we? You've been, every time you've come on really over these past few months, focusing on the state of the Russian economy, particularly in relation to energy and fuel prices. What's the latest on this? I know you've got a collection of stories here.
Well, quite, Francis. It's really the Achilles heel, it feels, for the Kremlin. And of course, your listeners will know the context of these oil refinery strikes is that there were reports earlier this week, I think via the FT, saying that the US intelligence has been helping Ukrainian drones deliberately target these strikes. I'm sure you covered it, to quote, bring Russia and Putin to the negotiating table. So that's the context. Analysts are saying now Russia may have lost up to 40% of its refining capacity. So this is a huge amount and has accelerated massively in the last couple of months as well. So there's that to bear in mind. I'm now reading that petrol prices have gone up by 60% since April. Reports of shortages in Novosibirsk. This is a big city in southern Siberia towards Kazakhstan. And this is the first time I've heard reports of shortages there. The major cities in Russia haven't actually been experiencing much shortages. We're still not getting many reports. I know there have been some photographs coming through, etc. But the people I can speak to in Moscow, St. Petersburg and Kazan, three largest cities in Russia, are not reporting widespread shortages in any way. So we've got to keep that in mind. But as we know, the Kremlin does try and prioritize these key areas. So we've got another warning of a recession in Russia, this time from a Kremlin-funded think tank, Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting. So this is from one of the Kremlin's own think tanks, saying that the entire Russian economy is going to tip into a recession next year. There are these VAT increases expected or scheduled for January 1st, raising VAT from 20 to 22%. So a large increase. And it's entirely, the Kremlin's even said this, the funds are going to go to its war machine in Ukraine. So the Kremlin think tank saying there's going to be a surge in sales. Everything's going to look great for the Russian economy for the rest of this year as people try and get in there shopping, try and get deals done, etc. before the VAT increase. But then after the VAT increase, it's going to all fall apart. So there's that coming from a Kremlin-owned think tank a week or so after more companies are putting their staff on 4-day weeks, etc. And we've even had an unusual protest in Vladivostok in Russia's Far East. This was a sanctioned protest. I need to caveat that this whole little sidebar with that. Reports saying about 500 people are protesting against increase in taxes for imported cars. These are coming in on November the 1st. This is yet another way for the Kremlin is trying to fund its war machine, etc. So you've got 500 people quite a lot. Protests in Russia are generally not allowed. This one was sanctioned by the local authorities. It's the anti-Kremlin sort of sentiment of the protest that's important. There were posters saying a car isn't a mortgage, it's a means of transportation, i.e. it's an essential product. Posters said they get Mercedes, we get Zhigulis, i.e. it's all right for the wealthy officials in Moscow. So it's so important to watch these little upticks in protests in Russia, Francis, not because we're expecting a tidal wave and a sudden revolution, etc. But you can just sense the frustrations of ordinary Russians just suddenly coming up to the surface. And I think this is one of these occasions that I really wanted to flag up to your listeners.
Let's go to our final thoughts now then. Dom, where do you want to start?
Thanks, Francis. So you'll remember Francis mentioned earlier on Martin Jaeger, the German intelligence chief who had been ambassador to Kyiv sometime in his career, who said that his opinion was that Russia views restraint as weakness. So I didn't know Francis was going to give that report, but I thought that absolutely chimed. So hold that thought for a moment, restraint as weakness. Have a listen to these words today from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He was speaking at the NATO's Parliamentary Assembly in Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia. So he was talking in the context of this, should NATO shoot down Russian jets that violate airspace and these drone incursions, what have you. So Mark Rutte said, if a plane is a threat, we have the authorities to do the ultimate. But if the plane is not posing a threat, we are not going to shoot it down, just gently guide it out of our airspace. Because we are so strong. We are so much stronger than the Russians, we don't have to take down Russia's airplanes. If we were weak, you might think, OK, we're big, so we have to immediately show them whenever they enter our airspace, we shoot them down. But if they don't pose a threat, being so much stronger than the Russians, I think it is much stronger that our reaction is as it is, proportionate, and, of course, making clear to the Russians that we are not too happy about these incursions. Right, that was a direct quote. Remember, Martin Jaeger says Russians see restraint as weakness. So my question to you is, what message do you take from those words by Mark Rutte? And what message do you think a bunch of murderous, cowardly thugs would take from those words by Mark Rutte? What does it do for NATO's credibility? And do comments like that offer enough grey area, enough wiggle room for Russia just to keep pushing a little bit further? Or does it leave them in no doubt whatsoever what NATO's response would be? Is it more powerful to have useful ambiguity or certainty? I'm not saying Mark Rutte is right or wrong to make those statements. I was a little bit surprised by them, I have to say. I'm not saying he's wrong, because useful ambiguity might be a good thing. But what message do you think Russia's going to take from it? As, to quote Martin Jaeger, thank you, Francis, restraint Russians see as weakness.
Thank you very much, Tom. Food for thought. Hamish, where do you want to leave listeners today?
Thank you. Just a little canter around my room on a particular hobby horse of mine, and that's lessons learnt. A lot of old experts like me suggesting that maybe the British military are not learning the lessons for Ukraine, which I think they absolutely are. And as I was on my massively delayed train from London last night, I was reading a certain war studies essay of a certain person at Sandhurst at the moment that has to be delivered, I think, later this week. And I was delighted that it was all about what are we learning about warfare or the ground in Ukraine at the moment that perhaps would have helped in other battles. And this particular one was relating it to Normandy landings and the real difficulty of fighting in the bocage, the hedges and the ditches. What could we have learned? And actually the conclusions, we could have learned quite a lot. So I think anybody who is concerned that the British military are not absorbing those really important lessons from Ukraine, I can assure you they are, and at pace. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hamish. James, you've got the final word.
Thanks, Francis. Having a look around the Telegraph sphere as usual, and surprisingly, there's a lot of chatter about how regions in Russia are actually struggling for recruitment numbers. The Kremlin's been very coy about this, but one particular oppositionist Russian news website, for want of a better term, reckoned that only about 38,000 soldiers were recruited by Russia in Q2 2025. This is down from about 90,000 in the same period last year. So that's a huge drop. And I mean, there's no absolute way of correlating this, of confirming this, but I have noticed 7 or 8 regions in Russia actually start to increase the signing on bonuses that they're offering for soldiers. That has to be an indicator, because we know that Russian recruitment has been heavily influenced by the size of these signing on bonuses. An increase in signing on bonuses does seem to suggest they're struggling for numbers. I had come on this podcast a few months earlier to say I'd seen a decrease. So this seems to be a switch in policy in some of these regions. So that is really interesting. I just want to pair that with, there was a blog post by a particular pro-war Kremlin Z blogger dude who was laying out why people are getting frustrated and not signing on. He's saying, the slow pace of the war, the terrible conditions, seeing all these veterans with no legs come back into the streets were all putting people off. This is a departure from Z blogger's normal diatribe. And that particular post, for instance, got something like 4,000 comments, which is a huge amount on the Russian Telegram sphere. And most of them were agreeing with this particular blogger's stance.
Thank you very much, James, for your insights. Look forward to having you on again very soon. So wherever you're dialing in from around the world, we wish you all the very best from us in London, from Salisbury, and from wherever James is. I better not ask in case it's somewhere more glamorous than where we are. But anyway, thank you all very much. Goodbye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, boys. Huddersfield.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.